The following message was given at Calvary Christian Fellowship in Colton, California. For more information about CCF, you can visit us on the web at ccfcolton.com. We thank you for taking the time to listen, and we pray that you'll be blessed as you study God's Word with us.
Esther chapter 4, verse 10, Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the peoples of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court of the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself, this is Esther speaking, have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So when we were last in this book, Queen Esther had been told by her guardian Mordecai of the need to intercede on behalf of her people. Haman, the prime minister of Persia and the villain of the story, has arranged for all the Jews within the kingdom to be slaughtered in just under a year. This includes all the Jews from Ethiopia to India, including the land of Jerusalem, where they have just resettled. Esther has asked for a 3-day fast, which we just saw, from her people to be sure of the present time or the proper time to present herself to the king. She is risking her own life in doing this if she arrives at a bad time. So now we pick it up in chapter 5. Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter, and the king said to her, What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom. So Esther answered, If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. And the king said, Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. It took Esther 3 days to become strengthened by God to pursue this course. You and I miss the drama that is here, the thought of her walking toward the king's chamber uninvited was a daunting prospect for this young lady. She's decked out in all of her royal regalia. I mean, if he's going to kill her, he's going to have to kill her with the robes on. And she's right there in line of sight with the king. Whatever insecurities she had dealt with personally and internally. Remember, the king had brought on a whole new class of virgins in the recent days. Whatever was going on in her heart internally, the king, though, he immediately looked upon her favorably and was gracious toward her. The king genuinely loved Esther, extending his royal scepter and a typical invitation to possess half of his kingdom. Esther simply requests that he, the king, and Haman attend a special feast prepared for them. Toward the end, Ahasuerus is ready to hear her true request. Verse 6, At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done. And then Esther answered and said, my petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king said. Huh? The king is intent upon Esther's satisfaction. He really does want to give her what she wants. He recognizes she has risked her life to ask this simple question. He wants to know. He pushes the agenda and asks her again. And the eyes of Haman and the court are all squarely fixed upon Esther, in awe of the chance to ask a favor, a request of the king. Can you imagine this in the royal court if you were the one that the king asks what your request is up to half of his kingdom? Could you imagine being that person? Esther looks at the king and asks to have another chance to entertain he and Haman the next day, and she'll reveal it then. What a strange moment. You and I are left scratching our heads, and I wonder if Esther wasn't doing the same thing after the banquet let out. She probably thought, as you and I would, why didn't I take advantage of the moment? Everything was right. I had everybody there that I wanted. I had the king's invitation. I had the request in my heart to ask, and it didn't happen. I didn't feel free to do it. You have to consider that Esther felt a sense of confusion and then fear. What if something changes in his tone tomorrow? What if something comes up and the banquet has to be canceled? What if Greece attacks on the northern front and all of them go out to war? I'll have lost my opportunity. The information we are not given leaves us with a lot of questions, and that's really the way the Bible is, isn't it? How many times have you read through the Bible and you've wondered, Lord, why didn't you tell all the other details that could have been helpful here? Like what was going on in her mind? What was she thinking at this time? Somehow, even though all the pieces were in place and the timing seemed perfect, Esther in the moment knew it wasn't the right time. Something still needed to work out. This is one of the most advanced concepts in my mind in following the Lord. God's will isn't just about the right action. God's will is about the right action performed at the right time for the right reason. It's not always the zeal to do the right thing. It's the understanding of doing the right thing at the right time. You and I are called to live by faith and not by sight. How many of you wish it was reversed? I do every day. I wish I was given the opportunity to live by sight. I wish I could graduate from faith to sight. I wish I could have it that way. But God says that we will walk by faith and that our salvation is from faith to faith. We're always going to be faithing. We're called to follow the leading of the Holy Spirit, and that can sometimes mean waiting when we want to pounce, and vice versa. God is most certainly the one, even though He's not given credit in the text, who put on Esther's brakes and led her to this decision. We're going to leave Esther here for a moment. Let's follow Haman out from the banquet. Verse 9. So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him be above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Haman was about as happy as a man with his riches could be. That is, until he saw Mordecai in the king's gate. He didn't bow or even tremble at him. And Haman's joy and glee turned to inner rage and fury at the thought of Mordecai's disrespect. The word indignation, because he was full of indignation. Think about this. He's just come out of a privileged banquet. He's just eaten the greatest foods that Persia can offer. He's walked out and he's happy and satisfied. And in that moment when he looks at Mordecai, now he is filled full of indignation. That word is also used figuratively elsewhere in the Old Testament as venom or poison that rushes through the bloodstream. And when we allow such hatred in our lives to rule, it is indeed a poison. That's the one thing I remember Pastor Ed speaking to us many years about. One phrase that stuck out to me at all times was, when we allow bitterness in our hearts against somebody, it's like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. That's what we're doing to ourselves. That's what was flushing through Haman's life. And for a man like this to be so full of indignation, that poison, because a simple man wouldn't bow to him, is just irrational. Haman felt this acutely, but forced himself to calm down before going home when he called together his friends. And part of his therapy at this moment was to boast of everything that he had. Maybe he could bring himself out of this. Maybe he could come out from this. He's the possessor of great wealth. He has a wonderful brood of children, 10 sons that we'll learn about later. He has position in life given to him by the self-proclaimed King of Kings. He has respect of all the people in the court, with the exception of one. Then to top it all off, he's the queen's guest. The queen wants him around. The royal family. He gets to hang out with the royal family and have these banquets, not one, but two. What does all that amount to? What would you pay for that? If you could have all those things I just mentioned, what would you give for that? Most all of us would, in our hearts, at least at the beginning, we would give everything for these kind of things. To have great wealth, a great family, great position. But for him, it amounted to nothing. It couldn't take away the sting of what Mordecai wouldn't give him. Every time he saw Mordecai at the gate, all of that stuff was wiped away. He couldn't even think about it. He would turn everything in just to remove Mordecai from view. Verse 14, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so that he had the gallows made. You know, I tell you, behind every great man, there's a great woman. Behind every sadistic man, there's an even more sadistic woman. Oh, honey, can you see this woman? By the way, her name means gold. And she's as good as gold. She knows how to get her husband into the right spot. You know, honey, you just need a little murder worder. You just need a little killy poo. That's what you need to do, honey. You just need to come here. Come here. You know, what a woman. She wants to comfort him. He's had a bad day. So what other way can she comfort him? I know. Let's build an impaling stake and put it in our front yard. She wants to give him some positive action. She wants to take all that aggression and put it into some positive action for him so that he doesn't take it out on the rest of the family. They're gathering for dinner or whatever else they're doing. But gosh, you don't need to be mean about it. Let's find a way to get this thing out of your life. I know, a 75-foot pole to impale your enemy on. That'll make you feel better. After you kill him, then you can just go to the banquet and have a great day. It's amazing. All this is being plotted against Mordecai. I want you to think about this as a godly person. How many times there have been these moments in the Bible where the enemies of God have been plotting against Mordecai? Now, we don't see Mordecai anywhere, do we? We don't see him fretting or worrying about everything that's going on. He has no idea, perhaps, that this is the most present threat against him. I've thought about so many different stories in the Christian life where people have tried to come against God's people. I remember Balaam sitting up on the top of the hills, and there he is looking down, and they're trying to pronounce a curse. Israel's down in the valley doing just fine. They had no idea. They had no clue what was going on against them. Weapons that were being formed against them. And here Mordecai, he's at present under this great threat. There he is, just kind of hanging out. And Haman is planning all this stuff. He's building a gallows for him. How is God going to get Mordecai out of this mess that he doesn't even know he's in? Let's leave Haman now at his house, and let's go over to the chamber of the king. Take a look at chapter 6. That night, the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles. And they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." Consider this most important night in the land of Persia, in Shushan. Esther is on her knees before the Lord, begging him, "Lord, I really felt like that was it. I blew it. I should have said something. I should have just pointed him out." She probably was afraid that she would have put the king in a bad spot because maybe there was a lot of different people there that were all pro-Haman. So maybe she didn't want to say anything at that time, but she is just all night going, "Lord, I need another chance. I know I blew it. I should have said something." Haman, meanwhile, is up to his knees in sawdust, partying and gloating over this freshly constructed gallows. Meanwhile, in the royal chamber, the king has a sudden bout of insomnia. I don't know what's worse. Have you ever had this where you are going to sleep, you fall asleep, and how many of you have had that experience where you fall asleep and you have a dream immediately where you feel like you're falling and you wake up and you do that? I think everybody's had that experience, unless it's just something I've done, but in any event, it happens to me almost every night. You kind of jolt like that, then you're back to sleep. The worst experience after that is when you fall asleep, your eyes close and you're done, and then your eyes just open, they're wide, and you're wide awake for no reason. You're not thinking anything, you're just awake. Has anyone had that experience before? That's an awful experience. Well, that's what happened to the king. He's sitting there, and all of a sudden, he's just awake for no reason. It got bad enough after he did everything. I mean, you know what you do when you're trying to go to sleep. For us who are Christians, easiest way to go back to sleep is try something spiritual. Try praying for someone. You'll be out before your prayer's over. Trust me. It got so bad, he finally goes, "You know what? There's only one way to stop this. Bring out the Chronicles." And if you've ever read Chronicles, you know this is surefire. This is surefire. First 10 chapters of the book of Chronicles, obviously this is the Chronicles of the Kings of Persia, not one we have in our book. But if you've read the Chronicles in our book, you know the first 10 they're very sleepworthy. But of all the things to call for, this is the king, the most powerful man in the world. He could have had the best musicians brought in. He could have had a whole drama team. Obviously, they didn't have TV back then. He could have had, a drama team come in. For me, it would have been Ron Popeil and some sort of infomercial, selling me knives I don't need. I would have loved that. He could have had a whole host of women brought in. But somehow he settled on this idea of having the Chronicles read to him. I don't know where he got that idea. So the king, the servant of the king, I'm going to suggest his name is Harbona, brought out the scroll and kept checking to see if he was still awake. He read through a certain section and he's having a hard time staying awake. But he keeps looking over and says, okay, I'll read one more section. And the king's just wide-eyed. He's not even dozing. For those of you that have had children and you feed them in the middle of the night, you know what this is like. When you feed them and you're thinking, okay, now it's your responsibility, kid, to go to sleep. I've done my part. Now you do your part. And one of our kids, I'm not going to mention which one, she's the oldest, she would stay up she would just look at me like, what are we going to do now, Dad? What are we going to do now? With every section that Harbona finished, he looked over at the king and the king's like, well, keep going. It wasn't working. And the servant kept thinking, man, can I drone on any further? But this lack of sleep was a divine action. God was going to keep the king awake until he got to Mordecai's story. And you will remember what happened at the end of chapter 2 when Mordecai unveiled the plot against Bigthana and Teresh. They had plotted an assassination against the king. And Esther reported it in Mordecai's name, not telling the king about her relation to Mordecai. So this had occurred 3, maybe 4 years earlier. Everybody's moved on. It's out of the national consciousness. When it happened, it was a blip on the radar. It didn't even move the needle. Some people believe perhaps that it was because of Haman. When Haman came on the scene, whatever Haman did was so dramatic, it sort of stole the thunder of this plot being thrown out in front of everybody. But whatever the case, the king now realizes in the middle of the night, in the silence of the night, and most of you who have been up in the middle of the night, you know it is dark, it is silent, and all you have is the thoughts in your own head. And the king is now aware for the first time in 4 years of a radical oversight. He blew it. Mordecai's actions deserved recognition, and its neglect made the need for it much more urgent and far more extravagant due to the king's oversight. Can you hear the king coming to his senses as he reads this? As he hears this read to him? Okay, what did we do for Mordecai? Get to the next part. What did we do for this guy? I don't remember. Did we have a parade? Did we give him a tax-free exemption for 100 years? And then the servant reads ahead and flips through. And then he just says flatly, we didn't do nothing for him. Oh gosh, what do you see in the eyes of the king? He didn't honor a man who saved his life. Well, that was going to change that very day. Verse 4, so the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servants said to him, Haman is here, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man who the king delights to honor, wink, wink, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king is ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, to parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Can you see Haman's face? Can you see how much he's enjoying this? How excited he is? The night's passed. Neither one of these guys has slept. They're both excited to tell about their brilliant idea. They can't wait. I just see Haman coming in and going, I got an idea. The king's going, oh, me first. Here's a me first. Let me tell you mine. And before Haman could get a word out, the king asks him this question, and Haman just loves this moment. Everybody wants to be the king's advisor. And amazingly, this man who's been so honored by the king actually thinks it's him. This is the megalomania that's going on in this man's mind. This is how great he is. Who else could he possibly want to honor but me? This man was insane. And Haman's mind is racing to figure out, and he's just spitballing here. This is just what comes to his mind. Well, let's get your robes on the guy. Let's get you in the greatest thing that you've got running. He'll ride in style. The prince, the famous prince around him, will array him. That means he'll put the coat on him. He'll put the robe on him, make sure he's completely dressed, and then he'll act as the herald to publicly say these things. And King Ahasuerus is loving Haman's creativity. And he responds enthusiastically in verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Have you seen him, Haman? He's right over there. You probably haven't known him yet, but he's over there. That's his name, Morty, I call him. Mordecai over there. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. Oh, the king wants this done now. And the irony is amazing. Remember that the king had just a few days earlier given these mystery people into the hands of Haman. Here now, or rather in chapter 3, that's what happened. Haman basically, the king signed over the Jews into his hands. Now Haman's hands are full of blessing for the chief provocateur of his ire. Haman will be forced by royal decree to honor the Jewish man that he hated the most. Now this gives us a little insight, by the way, into how little the king seemed to know about this plot. That he just signed this decree a few days earlier. Notice how he wants Mordecai the Jew to be honored. Why honor a Jewish man if they're all condemned to die? This lets us know that the king basically just took the money and run. He didn't really care who was destroyed. He just took Haman's money and the pledge for it, and he says, let's go. But now Haman is standing here speechless. I just see the king saying these words, like walking up to Haman and going, do this for Mordecai the Jew. And then he walks on by, and he doesn't see Haman's face turn white and his jaw hit the floor. Can you imagine the humiliation? After he says, do all that you have spoken. Oh, what a punch to the gut. Haman, this proud prince, this megalomaniac, is leading Mordecai through the city square, calling on everybody in sight to recognize and honor his enemy. For Mordecai, this was undoubtedly a surreal day, and seemingly one that ended with him just going back to the office. Did you see that? Mordecai's been on this horse for a few hours. Haman's been walking him around. This is the man that the king wants to honor. It's just killing him every time he says it. Every time he says it, he grits his teeth and just is defeated over and over again. Every time he says it, and Mordecai's just like, I don't even know what I did. What did I do to deserve this? I don't even remember what happened. Oh, that's right. I forgot all about that. At the end of the day, Mordecai just goes back in. He clocks into work. It's just like nothing happened. He has his coffee. He's sitting there with his bagel, his knish, and he's hanging out. Haman, though, is under the crushing weight of defeat, and he covers his head because he can't bear to be seen. He goes all the way home, and then we find him in verse 13 when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men. And his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Zeresh is out of great ideas. I mean, she had the gallows idea, but now she's got nothing. She's got nothing here. She sees her man leaving that day, and her man is confident. On top of the world. Nothing can get between Haman and what he wants. He's got his gallows. He's got his idea. He knows he has the favor of the king. He's walking out. He's got his lunch pail in hand, and he's happy. And now he's coming back, and he looks like he's lost his mother unexpectedly. He's in mourning. I mean, she doesn't know what to say to him. But they interpret things rightly. They said, listen, if Mordecai's on the rise, he's of Jewish descent, he's a national hero, that's bad news for you. Boy, did you pick the wrong enemy. Thanks a lot, Zeresh. How about a little encouragement here? Mordecai's ascension was just as unexpected and meteoric as Haman's had been. But now Mordecai was rising and Haman was falling below him. While he was taking in that truth, here come the escorts to bring him back to the banquet he had completely forgotten about. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to the Queen Esther, who is he? And where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Other versions say he wet his pants before the king and queen. This is the definition of an epic bad day. But it has been a day of confirmation for Esther. What do you think Esther thought? Remember her night. All three of these people, none of them have slept. They're at this banquet, none of them have slept. All three of them had very different nights. Esther woke up and she was wondering, Lord, what am I going to do? I got to get this thing done. I don't know what. I really blew it. And then she sees out there's Haman running her guardian around. What do you think she thought when she saw Haman humiliated before the presence of her guardian? She puts it together. This is the peace that was needed for God to bring my request to full strength. You see, here's the moral of this, right? As we think about this as Christians, and Ritzy and I were talking about this earlier today, about sometimes when you want to do something and you know it's the right thing to do, but somehow circumstances or God allows some interruption to come, and you're unable to do those right things that you want to do. So say, for example, you want to witness to somebody, and you've got them right where you want them. You've argued them into the corner, and then some guy walks over to the bench, and he's sitting there, and he asks you a question, and the person you're witnessing to walks away. And you're like, no, not now. I know I look good in this shirt and everything, but really not now. It's not the time to compliment me. No, okay, that never happened. But you have the idea. You want to witness to this guy, and you have him on the doorstep, and then nothing. Some circumstance comes up like that. Or you're talking to him, and you just sense, man, this isn't the time. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It does mean that God is just beginning to work, and that there's more to be done, and that when God is done, the right action at the right time will produce the right result. We don't get to determine that. Esther now realizes this is why God had me wait, because now it's a home run. I don't even have to say much. God's already doing the work, and I'm just going to come alongside of it and confirm it. It's amazing. There used to be a CNR commercial. Many of you are too young to even know what CNR is. It was a suit place. These guys would go in and they would get a suit, and 24 hours later they'd have it done. And the commercial was, what a difference a day makes. 24 little hours. What a difference a day makes. What can God do with a day? Yesterday was awful. Doubts, uncertainty, sadness, confusion. Today, clarity, wisdom, strength, confidence. An awesome sense that God is doing something here that I'm just participating with. She tells him, listen, you know what, if you had sold our people, I'd have been okay with it. You would never be compensated. Our people are good citizens. They are smart citizens. The Jewish people, wherever they've gone, have made life better. Look at the nation of Israel today and the technological advancements that are going on in the medical careers of people that are studying medicine in Tel Aviv. It is unbelievable the things that they're capable of, militarily, otherwise. Fascinating people. The queen says, there's no way you could ever be paid enough for all the value that they bring. In the meantime, the king is as surprised as anyone in the court. The king doesn't know anything that's going on. Who could possibly... He comes up to Haman, right? He puts his arm around him and he goes, who could possibly do this to you, my queen? Because remember, Haman's his right-hand guy. And then she points him out. Now at this point, Haman is 1 inch off the ground. He's doing everything he can to become part of the furniture. He's trying to hide. And he's doing everything he can to become camouflaged from what is happening right here. And she points at him and says, Ishtar, adversary and foe and enemy. And understandably, this man just about loses it all right there with fear. Verse 7, then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, the guy who'd read those chronicles all night, one of the eunuchs said to the king, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And the king's wrath subsided. Remember, Ahasuerus was a man, King Xerxes was a man of great temper. He's the guy who, when his army was moving along toward Greece, a man with 3 sons asked him to allow one of his sons to remain so that he wouldn't lose all of his sons on the battlefield. The king said, "Well, you won't have to worry about it," and he cut him in half. I know, too soon. You all look very disturbed by that. But he cut him in half, and then he put one half of him here, the other half of him here, and the army marched through the pieces. That's King Xerxes. He's not a sensitive type. And he's not one to take insult like this. He's walked off. He's trying to cool down. He's a man given to temper, and he wants not to be so irrational. I mean, this is his prime minister. You can't just kill your prime minister. That's not the easiest thing to do. So he had to walk this off to consider what he would do. And as he's cooling off, somehow Haman took the opportunity to beg for his life. It's amazing, a man like Haman. Here he is, callously willing to just destroy in a genocidal campaign every Jew from Ethiopia to India. And his one life is worth begging for. His own life is more valuable than all those lives he just treated as trash. He's begging for leniency. He doesn't want to die. Now, Persian law, what we don't understand is Persian law didn't allow you to come within 7 paces of the queen, much less be on the same couch as her. So I'm imagining this moment. Haman is getting up off the floor, because remember, in those days, they didn't sit in chairs. They sat on the floor. He's getting up off the floor. He ran his foot across a Persian rug, and he fell on the couch right next to her. The king has just walked back in. He's decided a course of action, but then he sees and he says, "Is he going to rape the queen in my house?" That's what he said. He was saying that he was going to sexually assault Queen Esther. And he lost it. Before he even finished the words, the servants just know, yeah, just bag him. Bag. This guy's toast. Get the bag, get the burlap sack. Don't even get the velvet one. Just put it right over his head. This guy's toast. Now he's condemned. The lights are out. His life is over. And that's when Harbona, who he's as tired as everybody else. I mean, those chronicles they're just so boring. He was up all night. "King, go to sleep, for goodness sake. I can't read any more of this." And he looks out and he sees from the citadel, he sees the 75-foot pole of impaling. He sees it out there. He goes, "Hey, this seems like a good idea." And the king knew exactly what to do. The very gallows that had just been completed hours earlier would now be inaugurated by the very man that ordered its construction. Wow. That's such a great story. Haman's shish kebab in the middle of town. I just love it. Chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Haman had just been bragging about all of his wealth and riches, and this is exactly what it is for the wicked every day. For the wicked in this world, what they have, it seems so permanent. It seems like it's all that anyone could ever want. But in a moment, it's gone. Joe was just telling me earlier, before we got here, as we were getting here rather, of a man who's his neighbor who died of a heart attack just a few weeks ago. Fit, healthy, running all the time, playing basketball, not a candidate for a heart attack, but just like that. One day you have everything. One day you are bragging about the riches and the wealth and the family and the position and the whatever else, and your life is over that very day. That is the brevity of life. We are but vapor. That is our life. It is just a vapor. It's here for a second and it's gone. Some of us feel like it's a long vapor. For goodness sake, we've been vaping for a while. And some of you, yes, it's been a long time. I won't mention any names. I really want to, but I won't. In the light of eternity, 70 years is nothing. 80 years is nothing. Think of this man Xerxes. Think of these men who lived all these years ago. They're dust. They are literally dust. They're nothing. And at one time they ruled the world. And here's Haman. On the very day that he thought was his greatest victory, it was his judgment day. For the wicked, for those that don't know Christ, that is where they go. That is how it goes. You live today, and this could be the very day that you no longer live. Mordecai had been scheduled for death. And now, not only is his life saved, he is now given the position of his enemy, Haman. He now has what Haman had. In fact, all the riches that Haman had were now given to Esther. And now Esther takes Mordecai and says, you are the prime minister of this nation, but I'm giving you charge over Haman's house. What a radical reversal. Now, when you look back at this scripture, I do pray that you will more fully appreciate the power of God's providential hand in your life. I hope you will appreciate God's timing and the way that He brings about things. Do you ever feel like you could have done it better? I do. I feel, Lord, we could have done this a different way. This was my plan and it would have been better. Yeah. God says, my way is permanent. My way is the best way. And I pray that you will look back over this story and see how God moved. You might be wondering, how is God going to move President Trump? I mean, we better protest, we better whatever. You know what? Why don't you pray he can't sleep a night and let him read the Chronicles? That might be better. But beyond all that, I hope that you will see the type. And as we come to communion, I pray you see this. Haman, of course, represents our enemy, who relentlessly plots our demise and desires to see us killed and destroyed. Do you remember that edict from Haman? Let's kill him, destroy him, annihilate him. the enemy of our souls, wants to steal, kill, and destroy, and devises cruel means to dispose of us. He's plotting against you every single day. And he stands as your adversary. He stands to accuse you, to say, oh, did you see their sin this day? Did you see what they did that day? And in the providence of God in our story, Mordecai avoided the stake that was set up for him. But in history, Jesus Christ stood on the stake and absorbed all the wrath of God against our sin. And as with our story, the final humiliation was put not upon the one that was devised against, but upon the enemy. Haman believed that he would see Mordecai destroyed, and instead was ultimately defeated on his own gallows. When Jesus Christ died, Satan not only failed to stop God's plan, but he ushered in the means of his own defeat. At the cross, Satan's plans against us were foiled. The curse was destroyed. Jesus became a curse for us. And when He died, it was accepted by God as a perfect sacrifice for all who would believe upon Him, so that the work of the devil was crushed once and for all. It was at the cross where Jesus freed us from the penalty of sin, saving us from Satan's schemes and saving us for Himself. And what happens to us now? The enemy would have destroyed us. The enemy would have wiped us out. But God saves us. And where do we end up? With all the riches of the inheritance of Christ. Not just Haman's household and all of his riches, but all the riches that are due to Christ. You and I have that when we trust in Jesus. What a beautiful story. What a beautiful way to get into communion. Let's pray.